Hello, everyone, and welcome to the second episode in our three-part series. We are so excited that you are joining us and tuning into whatever listening method you choose. This is Igniting Lifelong Literacy, a Chippewa River Writing Project approach. Before we get started with today's content, I would like to read our land acknowledgement. The Chippewa River Writing Project is based at Central Michigan University, located in Mount Pleasant, Michigan. Founded in 1892 as Central Michigan Normal School, CMU is located on the ancestral grounds of the Council of Three Fires, the Anishinaabe, of whom the Saginaw Chippewa Nation is one. Ceded under duress in the 1855 and 1864 treaties, this land was named the Isabella Indian Reservation and remains part of the homeland of the Saginaw Chippewa Indian tribe. It is our responsibility to care for this land and its people, and to be intentional and inclusive in our work. We recognize that this acknowledgement is only meaningful when combined with purposeful actions and genuine relationships that honor the land and its people. These actions include abdicating for the histories, cultures, languages, and the territorial rights of historic Indigenous peoples. As our writing project grows to include members from outside Mount Pleasant, we invite all CRWP members to recognize their own connection to the lands on which they reside and honor their own responsibilities to the original keepers of those lands. And in case you forgot, I'm just one of the hosts of this podcast. My name is Becky Schwartz, and my partner in crime, so to speak, is Lyndsay Young. If you want to know more about us, we encourage you to listen to our introduction episode and our first episode of this season as well. Today, we're going to begin our second part on the third part series of a very hot topic in literacy, especially in early literacy, which is science of reading versus balanced literacy. Today's episode will focus on the history and defining the science of reading, then a brief discussion on the application of the approach in our classrooms. I'm going to hand this over to Lyndsay, who's going to give you our mini lesson on the science of reading.
Thank you, Becky. So today, like Becky said, we are going to be focused on defining the science of reading, and then we'll get into, again, that end of the podcast discussion on how this science of reading approach affects us in the classroom. So first starting with this defining and understanding of science of reading. So in the 1990s, education was in the midst of a debate about using the whole language or phonics approach to teach reading. Through this discussion, the term scientific research-based reading came to be and was used in the federal education law to guide reading instruction, and researchers have come to believe the term was used by the National Reading Panel in their work and the foundation for the requirements in the No Child Left Behind Act. According to Indiana's Secretary of Education, Dr. Katie Jenner, the science of reading refers to a body of research from the fields of education, cognitive psychology, developmental psychology, and neuroscience that explains how individuals learn how to read and best practices for reading instruction. So, a misconception about reading is that all humans learn to read in different ways. And this is not true. The human brain is not pre-wired to learn to read naturally. So neurobiological research shows reading occurs in three different but connected areas of the brain. So the following three areas are used in cooperation to read words. So the frontal lobe is responsible for grammatical speech processing, in addition to information about sounds and words. The temporal parietal area is responsible for processing and storing speech sounds, where phonemes sounds are connected to graphemes, the letters, also involved in word and sentence meaning. The occipital temporal area processes visual information like letters and words. And I did have to practice saying those words, so I did not say those on the fly, just so you're all aware. So research used to construct science of reading includes simple view of reading and Scarborough's reading rope. The simple view of reading, the abbreviated SVR, reading comprehension, is developed through decoding and linguistic comprehension. So decoding is the ability to proficiently retrieve words from memory. Linguistic comprehension, interpreting literal and inferential meaning of words. So Scarborough created the reading rope that shows the components of SVR. The reading rope consists of lower and upper strands. The word recognition strands, phonological awareness, decoding, sight work recognition of familiar words. That works together as the reader becomes accurate, fluent, and increasingly automatic with repetition and practice. The language comprehension strand, background knowledge, vocabulary, language structures, verbal reasoning, and literacy knowledge, reinforces one another and then weaves together with the word recognition strands to produce a skilled reader. So now that we've gone through the basics of science of reading, let's get to the good part, my favorite part, in my opinion. Now we're going to be discussing how science of reading applies to us in our roles, in our varying roles, I should say, as teachers. So again, I will be taking the perspective of an elementary teacher, Becky, perspective from a high school teacher, and again, our very special guest, Jenny Sanford, will be talking to us from the perspective of a middle school language arts teacher. So let's get into the discussion. We'll first be talking about one big takeaway that we had from this information on science of reading. Then we will discuss how science of reading influences and impacts us within our classrooms. So we'll start with Jenny. So Jenny, what was your big takeaway?
In terms of science of reading, I have a fair amount of background knowledge about early reading tasks and early reading structures just because of the work that I did in my master's program, and then continue to do some tutoring work for quite some time afterward. But I think the majority of secondary educators come into this with very little knowledge, understandably, because it would not have been a part of the work that they would have done in their undergrad. But I think it's essential that as educators, we know where our kids are coming from and where our kids are going. I have the privilege of working for a small school district that we have a lot of vertical alignment, a lot of conversations across different buildings and grade levels. And so we talk about more of these sorts of things. But I think it's important that we understand the stages of reading and what reading and writing looks like at various levels. And for a number of reasons, so that we know how to help struggling students in our classrooms, not expecting that just because something was taught at an earlier level, we know it isn't. Kids learn at their own rate. And so there's things that need to be continued to work on even at a higher level with students. And then helping students make connections, helping students transfer. We know that when we can connect their background knowledge with their new knowledge, they're more likely to transfer that. And so understanding how reading takes place at lower levels, reading and writing take place at lower levels, can really help us as middle and high school level teachers.
Jenny, you had a lot of amazing thoughts there about how we can connect the background knowledge of what students bring to a text and this new learning, and how we can use those two things to help bridge further transfer of knowledge. So our next question for you is going to be, what parts of the science of reading influence or impacts you as a middle school educator?
As I kind of said in my last answer, I think there's definite usefulness in understanding the process of how reading happens at the elementary level. But along with that, though, there were some shifts in here that I found useful as a middle level educator.
Hey, it's Becky with another editor's note. As I was going through and editing this episode, Jenny references and in here, and again, she is referencing the book called Shifting the Balance, Ways to Bring the Science of Reading in the Upper Elementary Classroom. At the time of our interview, she was talking about the first edition of the text, and there's actually a second one that has come out now since we have been working on this podcast. It includes Kate Cunningham as a new author, but this is also by Berkins and Yates. It'll be included in our podcast notes with the episode. And now, back to your regular scheduled podcast programming.
Things to really be thinking about in my practice that could help my students in some of these shifts. The first one was in the first shift, talked about interactive read aloud. I think a lot of us do actually read out loud to our students, and a lot of us know the research that students can comprehend at a much higher level when a text is read to them versus when they're reading it themselves. But also the idea of what can we get out of, what can we gain from reading out loud to students, and making some intentional decisions about pulling words out that students will need assistance with, that we can support them with unfamiliar vocabulary, places where we can prep questions ahead of time or talk through our own thinking as a reader, and just finding places where maybe we can insert turn of talks and things like that. So really thinking about how we're using read alouds in our secondary classrooms. The next one was also in the first shift, the dialogic conversations. I love the idea of engaging them in a question. So the sample was, what was your favorite part of the book? And the student responds, and obviously this is an elementary level, when the mouse saved the lion. And then you repeat what they say, because you validate their ideas and expand. So, when the mouse saved the lion, that was surprising. And then engaging in another question, how do you think the mouse felt? So using those conversations that you have with students when you're conferencing with them and being able to lead them through their thinking in more complex ways by doing this engage, repeat, expand process with them as you're talking through text with them. Or even in writing. I mean, you can use that in writing as well to expand their thinking. In the fifth shift, I loved the lift the word protocol. So even our students encounter words that they don't know as they're reading. And we can teach them this protocol that once they understand it, it's something that they would be able to utilize independently as well. So pulling the word out of the text, breaking it apart, looking at, in our case, prefix, suffix, thinking about some of those root words that are in there as well, providing a definition if necessary, and then the process of then bringing that word back into the text and understanding it in context. And I think that's a really big one. It's great to have our students understand words in isolation, but when we bring it back into the context of their reading, then it aids their comprehension and the transfer of that word in the future in their reading. And then the last one that I really enjoyed was in shift number 6. It talked about honoring multiple ways of reading. And I think secondary-wise, we really get into, allowing kids to read audio, I think is a big one. Again, that same idea of that read aloud, it raising their comprehension by them listening to the text that they're reading. And I often do this in my class. Any student is welcome to listen to a text. I encourage them to have the text open and read it as they're listening to it, because they also have interactive work that they're doing with it while they're listening to it. But just honoring the different ways that our kids are coming to text and different ways that they have interest in reading text. And then the idea of supporting book choice as well. And there's a really great resource that I have read in the past and enjoy using in my classroom that connects with this one. No More Independent Reading Without Support. It's a This, Not That series book that just talks about that idea of, instead of expecting students to just go out and find books, that we would support that process of them finding books of high interest, books that would be complex, and we're moving them through levels of complexity. I'm going to throw out another book title here. Reading Ladders by Terry Lassane is another great book that talks how to work kids through that complexity as they go along. But I think there's lots in this book that not only just learning about early literacy, but then also finding some ways that it connects to your classroom.
I never like going after Jenny talks. She says so many good things, and I feel like I am just going to reiterate a lot of what she said when it comes to a secondary classroom. So I really appreciate the science of reading for a couple of reasons. I like that it's very brain focused, and it explains how certain parts of the brain function while reading. That was something, as we were researching, that came back to me from parts that I did in my undergraduate work, but it's really easy to forget in your day-to-day teaching as a secondary teacher, because a lot of us feel like these skills are sort of already taught, and we neglect to reteach some things at times because this is just something that the kids should know. So this kind of brings me to the second part of my answer here. So what it does in my high school classroom, I think the science of reading really helps you focus on those skills, right? So the skill of understanding the part of the word is often a big help when I have kids that come across unfamiliar words in high school, especially when you're doing science or heavy informational text reading. Breaking it down into its root words, those suffixes, those prefixes, and those other things, building on this skill helps them bring in the idea of being able to use context clues and all of those other things. It helps them build and gain a pattern of word understanding as well that they can transfer over time. And it definitely has been something that, as I've done it in my classroom, I see a higher and higher point of transfer. All right, Lyndsay, let's turn it over to you. What are your kind of big takeaways from this from an elementary perspective?
So my one major takeaway from the science of reading information, and something that I feel is important to remember, is the misconception of humans learning to read in different ways. So neurobiological research shows that for every person, learning to read occurs in the same areas of the brain. So for example, a study by cognitive neuroscientists in 2015, and yes, I will provide the study in the resources below in case you're curious of reading about the study, shows beginning readers are taught to focus on letter-sound relationships or phonics. This activates the brain on the left side, which includes the visual and language regions. So these findings show us that providing phonics foundation stimulates the brain in ways that change the neural pathways to support more efficient and effective readers. So by understanding the science behind reading and research, you are better able to help your students, obviously, to become effective readers. Unfortunately, the knowledge of many educators in the science of reading is lacking due to insufficient professional development or other factors. So the part of science of reading that influences or impacts myself as an elementary teacher, this idea of understanding the science and research of reading is so crucial to help students learn to read. So professional texts that I have read that help me look into my teaching practices and check and verify what I'm doing is based on best practice and research, and helps me to understand how to use research within my classroom, is the Not This But That series by Nell Duke. Many of you educators out there have probably heard of this series, but in case you haven't, I highly recommend it. So this book introduces an approach within the classroom, the research behind the approach, and how to apply the research into your classroom. It is extremely enlightening to see what you're doing and then have it affirmed or even maybe change your thinking as to better your teaching practice. So again, I will provide any sources we mention on this podcast at the bottom of our podcast.
It's interesting, both you and Jenny, Lyndsay, have talked about the This Not That series. I'm going to have to check that out. That is not one that I am super familiar with, but this conversation has really made me want to look into it more. But thank you, Lyndsay, for that great background on science of reading, and Jenny for joining us in this discussion as well. This was really fantastic to listen to, and I learned a lot from you and our shared research on this topic. For our next episode, we're going to talk about how you can use both of these approaches in your classrooms, and this is probably the conversation that you've been waiting for, because we're going to talk about how you can effectively blend both of these approaches and the best of both balanced literacy and science of reading to get the best results for your students. That's a lot of B's, a lot of alliteration here. So thanks for joining us on our second official episode. We'll be back next month with our 3-part series on the best of science of reading and balanced literacy and how to blend those. If you want to let us know how we're doing, or if you have any other ideas on what we should cover next, reach out to us at any time through email, Ignite CRWP podcast 383 at gmail.com. That is Ignite, IGNITE CRWP podcast 383 at gmail.com. We'd love to hear from you. You can find us anytime on Facebook and Twitter through the Chippewa River Writing Project's pages. We are at Chippewa River WP. Fire up, and we'll see you again soon.